This is the church I was brought up in Greenock in Scotland. It's the church where Anne and I got married. And after I'd left for a while, they decided that they would have a children's story as part of the service. But in the church at that time, women weren't allowed to speak up the front. And they decided that the children's talk was a kind of preaching, and so it was only the pastor and the deacons who preached. So they decided they'd get one of the deacons, I knew him as my Uncle Willie, would come and speak to the children. So that first Sunday, first children's story, all the families were excited. The children were brought down the front. They sat in the front seats. He got up and he told them the very first children's story, and it was about the angel of death from the book of Exodus. You can imagine the impact that had on the children. I'm told that some of the children that were the oldest in the family wouldn't go to bed that night. They were so tired. Well, tonight we're looking at another dark and disturbing story that really isn't appropriate for children. So I'm glad that our children have left. But something happens because that story that Joseph read to us, the slaughter of the innocents, when we are told that Herod had every child under 3 in Bethlehem murdered, because it's not appropriate for children, what often happens is we don't talk about it as adults either. It gets kind of cut out and censored from the Christmas story. And yet it's got a really important lesson for us. Maybe one of the lessons would be that sadly innocent children are still dying in that area today, reminding us that human evil hasn't really changed. But we are thinking at the moment about making Christmas more than a holiday. How to give Christmas real significance, making it more than having a few days off, opening presents, sharing food, good as those things are. When Matthew and Luke tell the story of Jesus' birth, they focus on the reactions that people have to Jesus being born. So you probably remember that the Magi, the wise men, were overjoyed when they saw Jesus. The shepherds were full of worship and praise, and they glorified and praised God. Mary was full of wonder and pondered things in her heart. But there was one person who had a very different reaction when he heard that Jesus had died. Maybe you heard it as Joseph read. We're told that Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. And about that time, the wise men from the eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We also saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." And it says that King Herod was deeply disturbed. Deeply troubled. And there's shades of meaning there. It kind of means that he was anxious and upset and worried and afraid. He was thrown into emotional turmoil over the fact that Jesus had been born. How many of you have been to a pantomime? Yeah, it's a kind of British theatrical tradition. And in every pantomime, there's always a pantomime villain, like Captain Hook or maybe Sleeping Beauty's mother-in-law. And whenever the pantomime villain appears, people are encouraged to boo and hiss. And I've seen a couple of churches do their nativity plays a bit like a pantomime. And Herod is always the pantomime villain. But he wasn't a pantomime villain. Anything but. The North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is up there. And if you know anything about him, you'll know that he's absolutely paranoid about threats to his power. And so he's had his brother murdered, he's had his uncle murdered, he's had numerous generals and other officials murdered, all because he thought that they posed some kind of threat to his power. And if you wanted to understand King Herod, a good way to understand him is that he was a 2nd century equivalent of Kim Jong-un. You see, Herod had literally crawled his way up to power. And when he got that throne, when he became the king, he was determined that no one would ever take it away from him. And so just in his immediate family, he had a wife murdered, 2 sons murdered, a brother-in-law, a mother-in-law, and a grandfather. We're also told that among his wider officials over his reign, he had around 300 officials put to death. All because he sensed that they might pose some kind of threat to his power and his throne. And so when you know that about Herod, it doesn't really come as a big surprise to discover what he did there in Bethlehem in murdering all those children who were under 3. He was utterly ruthless. He was ruthless and he was cruel, but the one thing that Herod wasn't was stupid. He was very right to be threatened by Jesus. He was absolutely bang on to see that Jesus was a threat to his power. And to understand why, we need to look at verses 4 to 6. We are told that when he called together all the people and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, he asked them, where is the Christ was to be born? In Bethlehem of Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But to you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, and out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And the reason that Herod got so paranoid and felt so threatened was he realized that the Christ had been born. Now, you need to understand something. Jesus Christ, the second part, Christ there, is not Jesus' surname. This is going to help you understand the Christmas story so much better, and in fact the whole of the Gospels and the New Testament better, if you just understand this one thing. Christ is a claim, not a name. Okay? Christ, whenever you see it in the New Testament, that's a claim, it's not a name. Christ, the word, it means in the Greek language, Christos, or anointed one. And in the Old Testament, among the people of Israel, the king was anointed. The king was the anointed one. And if you read through the historical books of the Old Testament, you'll discover that the kings were a very mixed bunch. Some of them were utterly bad. Some of them were good most of the time. But all of them, in different ways, led God's people astray. And that had disastrous consequences. And so as the Old Testament unfolded, this desire began to come together among the people of Israel for a king who would be righteous. A king who would consistently lead them in God's way. And God began to answer that desire. He began to make some promises about a special king, an anointed one, the Messiah. And he promised that this king would be unique in a couple of ways, that he would be a descendant of David, that he would be related to God in a way that no other king had been related to God before, that he would reign on David's throne, not just for a couple of decades, but forever, and that he would bring in God's perfect reign and kingdom of justice and righteousness and peace. It's a New Testament scholar who's got a great idea to help us understand what Matthew's first hearers would have understood whenever they heard that the Christ had been born. He says that every time you see the word Christ or Messiah in the New Testament, this is how you should translate it: God's rightful king who's come to rule. So anytime you see that word Christ or you read the word Messiah in the New Testament, have that in your mind. This is what it means: God's rightful king who has come to rule. And during Advent, what we do is we read those promises that God made in the Old Testament about this king who would come to rule. And so whenever they said to him that they thought the Messiah, this rightful king, had been born, Herod knew a couple of things. First of all, he knew that the Messiah, the rightful king, had come. Then he knew that he wasn't the rightful king. Because you see, Herod wasn't Jewish. He was actually a descendant of Esau. He was an Edomite. He knew that he wasn't the rightful king. And lastly, he knew if the Messiah had been born and he wasn't the rightful king, then the Messiah, the rightful king, had come to take his throne, to become the rightful ruler. And just like he'd done with his sons and his wife and his father-in-law and his grandfather, Herod knew that that child had to be eliminated. Anybody that threatened his rule had to be eliminated. And I need to tell you that Herod was absolutely right to feel that his power was threatened by Jesus. You see, as Jesus grew up, as you read on in the Gospels, you'll find that other people became troubled by Jesus. Other people realized that Jesus threatened their right to rule. And so the Pharisees saw Jesus as a threat to their need to control the religious scene. The Sadducees found Jesus as a threat to their right to control the temple. And ultimately, Jesus was crucified because Pilate and the Romans saw him as a threat to their power to rule over Judea and the Jews. And Herod might have been ruthless, but he was right. Jesus really is a threat. Jesus is a threat to all those who cherish the right to hold on to power, to run things their own ways for their own benefit. Dr. Callis was my preaching professor at Asbury Seminary. And he preached a sermon once on this very topic. And he had something quite significant and profound that I want to read to you. This is what he said. We're all people who want to be king or queen. Some of us don't get a very large throne, but we make the most of it. We start in our crib, from which we scream out our orders, and we generally keep at it as much as society and good taste will allow until we're on our deathbed. We like being king or queen. Here then is a Christmas word for you and for me. If your name is Herod and everyone's name is, then be afraid. Because the king has come and he is going to win. This little babe in swaddling clothes is going to win, brothers and sisters, boys and girls. It's time to get off the throne and give the throne to the only one who is eternally qualified to reign. And Dr. Callis's words provoked me to ask myself a question that I've got to ask you. So who's on the throne in your life right now? Who's reigning in your heart right at this moment? Who runs your life? Who has the final say over what you do and who you are becoming? The story that we read tonight reminds us that just like Herod, we are confronted by King Jesus. We are confronted by God's rightful king who's come to rule. And whenever we are confronted by Jesus, we are always confronted with a choice. I almost felt sorry for King Charles a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you saw this picture. He was going to the state opening of Parliament, and his carriage had to go by a big group of people who were holding up placards saying, "Not my king." And that is what Herod was saying to Jesus. He was saying, "I'm going to resist and reject you as the true king." And not many of us murder children. But so many people, just like Herod, resist and reject Jesus as their rightful king. I think one of the saddest verses in the whole of the Bible is in John chapter 1. It's describing the fact that Jesus came to the Jewish nation to be their Messiah, to be their rightful king. And this is what it says happened. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. So what about you? Have you accepted him? Now, I don't just mean have you accepted the offer of forgiveness. See, the New Testament scholar David De Silva points out that we can't have Jesus as our Saviour unless we are also willing to submit to him as our King. This is what he says. He says, we naturally gravitate to the part of the good news that highlights freedom from the dominion of darkness. But we tend to chafe against the part of the good news about living under a new king, a new master, a new Lord. But without the second part, we never actually experience freedom from the power of darkness. We resist Jesus and we reject Jesus because we like the freedom to run our own lives. We want to live as we want. We want to follow our own desires. We want to pursue our own dreams and our own goals rather than his as our king and his kingdom. We don't want him to be our king because we want to be our own boss. And the problem so often is that we want Jesus to be part of our life, but King Jesus demands to be the ruler of all of our life. And this rightful king doesn't want a corner of your heart. He wants all of your heart. He doesn't want to reign over your life some of the time, but rule over your life all of the time. If you watched the coronation this year, did you see this really significant moment where the Prince of Wales had to come and kneel before his father, King Charles, and pay him homage and allegiance? He had to bow his knee and pledge his allegiance, his complete obedience to him as king. And I don't know if you noticed it, but Matthew told us that's what the Magi were doing. They came and they kneeled before Jesus and they paid him homage. They gave him allegiance. They surrendered and pledged allegiance to Jesus as their rightful king. Probably know that I'm a Republican in the British sense. I find it difficult to pledge allegiance to a king. This is where it gets difficult as a Christian. Because you see, I need to pledge allegiance to a king, my rightful king. But here is the great news. Our king is not difficult to submit to. Our king's rule is not difficult to surrender to. He's not a king who rules by force or fear, but by love and mercy. He's not a king who oppresses and exploits, but who serves and sacrifices. He's a king that invites us to share his kingdom, not as subjects, but as fellow heirs. He's a king who welcomes us into his family, not as strangers, but as friends. He's a king who calls us to follow him, not as slaves, but as disciples. He's a king who empowers us to serve him, not just as servants, but as co-workers. So where are you when it comes to that throne in your life? Are you resisting and rejecting your rightful king? Or are you submitting and surrendering to his rule over your life? Whenever we submit and surrender to his rule, we enter his kingdom with everything that that brings, his calling on our life, and meaning, and purpose, and power, and peace, and forgiveness. And if King Herod was all about the love of power, we discover that King Jesus is all about the power of love. Living under the reign of King Jesus is life as God always intended for you. It's the best life you could ever live. Eternal life. A new life in terms of quality and quantity. And I want to challenge every one of us tonight. It's not about whether Jesus was on the throne in your life in the past, but is he on the throne right now? My mom used to sometimes, when we were young, put me on the same seat as my sister. I have confessed that I was an obnoxious younger brother. And I would move further and further over on the seat until eventually she got pushed off one side. Some of you are admitting to doing the same things. Sometimes as Christians we do that. We put Jesus on the throne. And then we sit beside him and gradually we move him over and over and push him off the throne. And so whose reign have you been living under this week? Have you been resisting his rule or living under your rightful ruler? Are you allowing Jesus to reign in your life? Are you surrendering to his reign in every area and aspect of your life? And it's great that this time of year we decorate our homes and we buy presents and we do all of those things. But let me tell you, the single thing that will make Christmas more significant and meaningful for you this time of year than anything else is making sure that the one born to be your king is reigning over your life. Maybe we need to put him back on the throne. Tonight is a night to give up your throne. To give the throne to the one who was born to reign. And if you haven't done that, if you know you've not been living under his reign, would you do that tonight? Would you put him on the throne? When our children were in the US, we discovered that every day the children there pledge allegiance to the flag of the US. I was thinking, what if we pledged allegiance to Jesus every day leading up to Christmas? What if we reminded ourselves every single day, at the start of every day, that we were going to live under his reign? And so I wrote a pledge of allegiance. I want you to read it. Just take a couple of moments to read it. And here's what we're going to do. In a moment or two, Elliot and Riley are going to lead us in a song called Reign in Me. Reign in me. Lord, take your rightful place on the throne of my life. I'm going to hand out that little pledge of allegiance, and I'm going to ask you, if you mean it, when we've sung that song, Reign in Me, to say it with me. And then put this somewhere. You'll see it every day. Maybe in your Bible, maybe on your mirror, maybe on the fridge. And every day leading up to Christmas Day, say the Pledge of Allegiance to Jesus. And just see what that does every day, intentionally reminding ourselves that we are to live under the reign of our rightful King.